So I recently did a podcast, two of them that were public anyway, on the American Revolution with the historian James Vaughan. And some were very surprised by that because it seemed oddly sympathetic to the American Revolution, which some people wouldn't have expected to come out of this podcast, given that I've been super scathing in my critique of American democracy and the United States in general. But the way I view the American Revolution is I view it as a product of its time in its context, right? It's a massive contradiction because on one hand, it's one of the most radical events that ever happened. In its history, it was immensely radical for its time. But paradoxically, because it was so radical in the sense that it was a full bourgeois revolution, in which it was a full establishment of a republic, whereas England was a compromise between feudal classes and the bourgeoisie, between parliament and the monarchs and the aristocracy. But in the context, the American Revolution was super radical, but that's also why it's extremely contradictory, because the bourgeoisie was really at the commanding heights of the revolution in the sense that they were able to essentially control how the system was designed. They designed a system that was so perfectly suited for the interests of the property owning classes that created a managed democracy in a way that was so perfectly managed. I believe it's the most perfectly managed democracy in the sense that it has the best of both an authoritarian system, like in this, it has a very strong presidency who can veto and have very centralized authoritarian power, while also having these checks and balances that prevent any faction of the capitalist class from dominating the others, which could destabilize the whole system. And also that checks and balances, they just pretty much check against the working class. We
Yes.
can't implement any policies because, healthcare, that would be unconstitutional. Oh, jobs guarantee, that would be a infringement on the rights of employers. So that's my angle of how I critique it, rather than I think on the left, there's this kind of critique, which is the US was founded on slavery and all that. And it's like, that's true, but that's not really unique to the US. I think genocide is, like, in the sense of manifest destiny, but that occurs a little bit later. But that is something I think unique to the settler colonial countries, which makes them kind of more culpable than many other countries. The thing that I try to emphasize is that we shouldn't abandon the hope of a democracy that the American Revolution unleashed, because we always have to remember that even though it ended up being controlled by the property owners, and you really see that the property owners get their full victory when the Constitution is established, when the Constitution is created with the convention that happens after the Shays Rebellion, which is sort of this attempt where, like, farmers and various other groups are really destabilizing the order and threatening the dominant classes. And so you have this kind of divide between the petty bourgeoisie, the artisan classes, who I would say are still, even though like they might marginally own some property, they're really within the dominated classes compared to the real property owners. So in order to have a socialist radical politics succeed today, I believe that we can't abandon that hope of democracy. We have to abandon our faith in democracy, the idea that there is a democracy. That's the
Yeah.
kind of noble myth that enables the order. People, I don't believe in the United States, are going to succeed by using communist iconography from the Soviet Union. They're not going to succeed by saying also nothing was ever good about the American project. A lot of the tools that the left has at its disposal and which it could use are already in the history of the United States. John Locke, who very much inspired the American Revolution, believed in the right to revolution. And he believed that if a government was to be despotic against its people, that there was a right for the people to essentially change their government and by force, if necessary, by revolution. And Jefferson believed the same thing. In fact, Jefferson thought there should be a revolution ideally every 40 years. And I think that's the great angle of critique, is the fact that capitalism and the ruling class are undermining democracy, and that what we really have is an unfinished revolution.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist.
by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Steve Grumbine, host of the Macro and Cheese podcast, which is a podcast all about modern monetary theory, known as MMT, as well as a wide variety of other topics. He's been branching out into history and into other theories outside of modern monetary theory, like Marxism. It's a wonderful podcast. I can't recommend it enough. I've been on it twice. It was an honor. Both those were really fun. One thing I really like about Steve Grumbine is he's the definition of what I would call a organic intellectual, driven by pure curiosity, and someone who's very practical. And I really like people who are on what I'm broadly calling the non-dogmatic left. And people on this channel already know that I'm a proponent of MMT. What we're going to discuss today is more broadly social democracy. We're going to be doing a little series on this channel on ideological tendencies on the left, what's good about them, what's worth keeping, and flaws in their approach. Social democracy is definitely worth talking about because probably that's the sphere you're most involved with in terms of who you've talked to. And largely MMTers tend to be dominated by people who are social democrats, whether they're on the more radical wing of the DSA or whether they're just Democrats who will be willing to work with the Biden government. So the themes we'll be talking about is UBS, Universal Basic Services, and why we believe it's superior to universal basic income, as well as the pitfalls of social democracy like electoralism, strategic approaches, and why haven't all social democrats embraced modern monetary theory. But first, I want to get into you, Steve. Why did you get into MMT? What was your, briefly, your political journey like into getting into all of this? Because I believe you didn't study economics formally, like a lot of the MMTers did, correct?
That's correct. I mean, I have an MBA, a Master of Business Administration. I have a Master of Science in Technology Management. So I had to be exposed to a lot of the classical economists, but it was told through the lens of the CFO, if you will, of United Airlines and stuff like that as your instructors. So you're getting a heavy dose of capitalism mixed with a lot of incorrect things that you don't know they're incorrect because you're paying a lot of money to learn this stuff from these professors, only to find out that maybe they weren't exactly on point. So it's been quite a journey. I started out on the far right, actually, as a Christian conservative, grew up a Reagan Republican, and my trip to the left has been nothing short of a long ride. It's definitely been a leftward drift. And I would say I am significantly left of anything that would pass for Democrat in the United States. But bottom line is that I'm evidence-based, I'm information-based. My thoughts and opinions tend to gravitate toward where there is factual support for the ideas and an imaginary or imagination-based approach to asking questions. Just why not? What would hurt? Why would this not work? Why would that work? So you could say I'm an explorer of sorts at this point because I'm not paid to do this. I mean, I do run two nonprofits that host the podcast that you told me so that I host, but quite frankly, those nonprofits, they're not real big. They don't pay a paycheck. So this is a matter of me truly trying to understand the world in which I live and trying, as a father, trying to understand what a better society would look like. And that has taken me through Marx. That has taken me through MMT. That has taken me through the Bernie Sanders movement. And it's left me somewhat of a man without a country, if you will. It's left me kind of left of the consensus, left of most MMTers. In fact, I find myself increasingly isolated from a lot of the MMTers because of that leftward drift. So it's an interesting place to be, lonely at times, but definitely going where the information takes me.
I definitely feel that not exactly having a ideological tendency to be able to neatly fit into. I find that myself too, being very critical, a lot of tendencies on the Marxist left, and part of why I even embraced Marxism to an extent was because of what I saw were the flaws of social democracy, to not recognize class struggle. And T is definitely and just another layer on top of that, because it's something that not even all social democrats have accepted, but it's growing rapidly. What's I find quite strange is the Democrats in the United States seem more quickly to embrace MMT than the Social Democratic Party of my country in Canada, the New Democrat Party, the NDP. They're really backward. They're really like in the Stone Age when it comes to their economics, and they never get votes, and they're always wondering why. And it's because they always talk about taxes and taxes, and it's people aren't stupid. They know their taxes are going to go up if you have that understanding of economics, and that you have to get get what you're going to spend from the taxpayer. So it's another that's probably the pill to swallow that is the hardest for people on all sides of the spectrum, but it's growing rapidly, and I think it's quite enlightening and useful and essential in my view. But you've spent much of your time talking about MMT. It's probably the biggest topic on Macro and Cheese. It's its original theme. So I guess for the basic question, maybe like a reminder, because maybe not everyone is fully pilled on MMT. Maybe people haven't seen my other stuff or your stuff. Why MMT? Why should people, left or right, whatever, embrace MMT? Like, why is it true? And what was that awakening moment for you in which you're like, it all makes sense? Because,
Right.
yeah, I can remember when that was the case for me with MMT.
Well, just think about it like this. I started out as a very, very right-wing, kind of a Christo-fascist of sorts. I mean, seriously, I have to embrace it and own it, because without recognizing that starting point, all the other stuff I say just doesn't really hold quite the weight that it does when you consider the ideological pivot that I took in my life. And it's significant because it fundamentally changes everything, but I still landed on MMT. I started MMT as a Republican slash becoming more of a libertarian, civil libertarian, loosening some of my social concerns, some of my social proclivities, some of the things that I thought were just so very, very wrong-minded in many ways. But regardless, that's how I was raised, and that was the environment in which I grew up in. And we can say we don't want to be our parents, but, I grew up to, in many ways, embrace the beliefs of my parents. And I carried them forward as I went through school. But MMT asked some stupid questions, some questions that just seem so ridiculous that you're like, why are you asking me that? Like little things like when people were putting the seeds out there into my brain, they were saying stuff like, have you ever seen a dollar? Do you know what a dollar looks like? I'm like, yeah, duh. And I pull out a paper dollar, right? This is like the clumsy, typical. That's probably what most people would do is like, that's a dollar, right? This piece of paper. And it was only when I realized that really a dollar is more of a unit of measure, okay? Like an inch or a pound. And so this seemingly esoteric, simple, silly kind of awakening was the pivot point. It was a starting point anyway. It was like, okay, so in other words, it's something else. And I started understanding credit, and I started understanding how people do exchange and things like that. And then what really got to me, I think the thing that finally really pushed me over the edge was some of Randy Wray's work. Randy Wray is one of the original developers of modern monetary theory. I had already read a lot of Warren Mosler, who is largely
L.
considered the
Randall Ray,
father of.
for those who don't know
Yes.
his nickname, L. Randall Ray, Larry Randall Ray.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, L. Randall Ray. And I used to always call him L. Randall Ray until he laughed at me in an interview one time and said, just call me Randy. It's like, oh, okay, Randy. Okay, I'll do that. But his writing name is L. Randall Ray. All his professional work shows up as L. Randall Ray. But he had written a primer on MMT in a bunch of blog posts, a series of blog posts on the publication New Economic Perspectives. And I think it's 53 blog posts. And of those 53, it takes you through step by step on so many of the questions people just toss at you about things they think they know about money. And he literally lays it out in very easy, understandable ways. And Warren Mosler, who was a hedge fund manager and millionaire, and people are like, well, why would you as a leftist want to know anything about what a hedge fund millionaire says? It's like, well, the guy knows what he's talking about. Even if you don't like his political angle, or even if you don't like the fact that he once ran a bank or was a hedge fund man or whatever, the point is he understands the way money literally works, and not just the way it works, but where it comes from. And I think that's the most important light bulb moment is Where does money come from? What is the nature of money? And what are taxes really for? Those three things really, really shook my belief system. Understanding, number one, that currency in terms of the US dollar as we know it, a fiat currency, meaning by decree, is a creature of the state. It's a creature of the state, whether it's the US dollar, whether it is the Japanese yen, the Chinese yuan, the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, the peso. All these are issued by the government. They're not issued by banks, although banks have authority based on the government giving them agency to create their unit of account for loans and stuff like that. The government creates its own money. And it was in that moment that I had that epiphany that said, well, wait a minute, hold on. If the government creates its own money, why the hell does it need my taxes? And that was a really big deal because as a right winger, you don't want your hard-earned tax dollars going to somebody's bad decisions, right? You don't want it going to their icky things like gay stuff, or you don't want it going to, I don't know, somebody's abortion. You think up the ick factor, whatever icky thing of the day that Republicans and right-wingers tend to get grossed out by. They didn't like that, and so they didn't want their hard-earned tax dollar going to it, paying for drugs, giving people drinks, whatever. There's all buying them processed food on their food stamps, whatever crazy, weird thing that right-wingers don't like at the day. That was the thing. And coming from that side and having to unplug from that and realizing that there's no money in the economy if the state doesn't spend. And somebody will say, well, banks create money and 97% of the money in the economy is banks. You say, well, that's a policy decision. Banks are lending to fill the gap that the federal government chooses not to fill with sovereign spending. So when you take out a loan, you get money. But that money, you use it, do whatever. The bank, in turn, keeps your interest that you pay on the debt. But the rest of it wipes out, it zeroes out. And I'm like, what do you mean zeroes out? And then it was like, but your taxes do the same thing. When the government issues money out to you, that's your asset, but that's the government's debt. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. So in other words, money is debt? And you'll hear Warren Mosler say that the national debt, for example, is the sum total of every untaxed dollar in the economy. And so it's like, wait, hold on. And then you'll hear him say, but the dollar is just a tax credit. And you're like, what does that mean? So in other words, it's for redemption, not for spending. In other words, that's the lure, that's the hook, that's the magnet that forces us to use the government's money. That's why Bitcoin and things like that will never replace the dollar, because as long as the state is able to enforce a tax, it's got an obligation payable only in its tax. And so this awakening right here, this stuff that I'm telling you about, was things that made me say, holy crap. So all the fighting between Democrats and Republicans about paying for things and raising taxes to pay for things and wanting to cut taxes because we don't want to pay for your bad decisions and all this stuff, it's like a pitched battle. It's fake. It's fraudulent. It's not real. It doesn't exist. It's a fight, but it's a fight over nothing. It's not real. And when that hit me, and that was a big deal because, I mean, God, how many fights do you have with whatever parties, political parties in your country and my country and other countries are all about not wanting your hard-earned tax dollar to pay for someone else's bad decision. And then when you find out that that entire paradigm is wrong, some changes come through. And then I would say the last really super big thing, other than the fact that the currency is a simple public monopoly by the currency issuing government, the other thing is the difference between currency issuers and currency users. And this light bulb moment is kind of game, set, and match, right? Because you understand that the currency issuing authority comes from law. It's a creature of law, as Rohan Gray, who is another one of the leading second or third generation MMT scholars, would tell you. Money being a creature of law means that the laws that surround money are created by your country, by the government. And the tax that it uses to incur an obligation that requires you to need that currency is why you do things. It's what creates markets. It's what creates buyers and sellers of goods, as Mosler would say as well. So understanding that, I said, well, wait a minute. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, this is specific to the United States. It's the same, ironically, around the globe, different legal reasons, but it's the same. Fiat currency works the same, period. And so with that in mind, I had to understand the difference between states like Maryland or D.C., Virginia. D.C. is not a state, but you get my point. These areas that are not currency issuers, they're currency users. And then the federal government being the currency issuer. And it's like, well, what does that mean? They're not like just printing money, which is, you hear everybody say, what are they doing, printing money? It's not printing money. What happens is the government pays its bills by an act of law. They pass a law. The law says who they're paying and what the price terms are and so forth. Once that law is passed, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution says Congress alone has the power of the purse. So Congress authorizes spending. The president signs it into law. The executive branch signs it into law. And then the Federal Reserve, with computers, keystrokes the amounts that the government said in their bill. He strokes those amounts into the government's bank account, and then the government writes a check and sends it out to whoever. And in most cases, sadly, you see it's the military, to Northrop Grumman, to Boeing, to Halliburton, to BlackRock, to whomever. And so that is how the government spends. And that money then, once it's spent into those areas, trickles down in the form of salaries and other payments to other companies that springs their work and other contracting agencies, et cetera. So that first dollar spent by the government is usually spent on government contracts. That was a big awakening too, having gone through business school, learning about contracts and hearing that the government takes out bonds to finance spending. Well, that's not really the case at all. The government literally does it by decree, by fiat, by law. So putting all that into perspective, if you stop, it's kind of like, okay, I've just been through a centrifuge, personal centrifuge. All the parts are scrambled. I got to wait for it to come back together for me to make sense. So all the connecting synapses and all the thoughts that I had about all these other things had to reconnect because everything changed with that understanding. And I think that that's what's hard for most people, because you see, what I just said doesn't neatly fit into a meme. It doesn't neatly fit into a one-page index card. Yes, you can say some quick things like taxes don't fund spending, but then you end up spending 10,000 words trying to explain what taxes don't fund spending means. And they're like, what do you mean? Of course they do. Look. So it challenges everyone's core understanding of what they think money is. It challenges everyone's core understanding of where they think money comes from. And it challenges people to really think beyond austerity ideas of reducing deficits and cutting spending, because now you realize that that's not really necessary. That's not really what you would want to do. And then you dig deeper, and you alluded to this, and this is, I'll cut off here. You understand class. Once you integrate class into your MMT perspective, you start beginning to understand what are the implications of the state being the monopoly issuer of the currency. And you say, well, we have a democracy. Well, do we? I don't think so. Do we have the ability to affect the spending as voters? I don't think so. I think that you see legalized bribery in the form of lobbying and legalized bribery in terms of all these other aspects of the revolving door between industry and government. And you can say, wow, government's captured. But if you understand capital and labor and the relations there within, you can start to begin to understand slightly different things. So Marxists and other socialists don't need to be afraid of MMT, because MMT is very neutral. It's benign. But the way it's leveraged in terms of the way the political economy of your government, of your nation works, is not benign. That's a very specific use case. It's not MMT. It's political economy. It's the value system that overlays the lens that is the operational reality that is MMT. It's a lot of words right there. But if you understand, you stop saying, well, I see them using MMT for bonds. Well, you don't use MMT. MMT is a description of the way a fiat currency works. But how different might a fiat currency work if you, Tony, or myself, or some of your listeners were the ones in charge of making the decisions, that it was democratized, that people actually were able to say, hey, we don't value that, or hey, we do value this. What if we were able to express our values through the money as the government spends it into existence? Since we don't really have that agency, and these are those moments where you're like, wow, we could have a Green New Deal, and wow, we could do all these great things. We could have universal basic services, which we'll talk about. You realize, well, wait a minute, hold on. There's this barrier between me and the ability to execute my class interests through this public money. And it is public money. It's not taxpayer dollars. How do you do that if you have no means to affect that through electoral politics, which is what traditional social democrats and most MMTers will just source the vote? This is where we depart, because I don't believe we have a democracy. And I believe that the placebo effect of voting actually keeps us further from organizing to show dual power, to provide a socialist perspective, a people perspective, a labor first perspective. Instead of us organizing and educating and each one teach one, each one reach one, we're busy stumping for candidates that don't even understand the stuff to begin with. And more importantly, into a system that was created for the wealthy elite, the landowners, et cetera, and not the people. And I think that's where I land here.
That was very, very well put. You gave two good segues there that I want to get into, one being the angle of class, and perhaps that's what we both might consider to be what is most lacking on the MMT front, a sort of class analysis, which probably was best articulated by a Marxist theory, as well as UBS and UBI. First, I do want to say ideology, because that is such a theme of what you're saying as well. And a big obstacle I find when explaining MMT to people is that people will say, well, if this was really true, what the MMTers are saying was indeed the fact, how come everybody doesn't know this? Like, how come this isn't common knowledge? And what's very interesting is, in the history of the theory of ideology, Antonio Gramsci, who basically takes Marx's idea of ideology, which is the ideas of the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, Gramsci's definition of ideology is common sense. He uses the terms interchangeably. I find that fascinating, because sometimes what is common sense is in fact literally folklore. That's not to say that common sense doesn't have kernels of truth. It often does, but it's always a non-contradictory truth. It's a very linear, one-dimensional truth that leaves out all the contradictions in that ideology and all the other aspects of reality that don't fit into the ruling class's framework, into the dominant purveyors of ideology. And certainly MMT does not fit into the ruling class's ideology. Some people will think it does just because the government prints a lot of money, and some people will say, well, they're practicing MMT. Aren't they doing MMT? Even though Jerome Powell openly critiques MMT, and all the people in power say they reject it. But because imagine that you tell people that this is how money works, that money is really a unit of measurement, that you can't run out of inches. It's like saying you can't run out of money is like running out of inches. If you tell people that, it really changes the perspective of what they can demand. And you touched on a great point, which is the MMTers will think, well, why don't we just use democracy to advocate for the public purpose? And someone like Warren Mosler, who is a fantastic explainer of MMT, brilliant genius economically, but sometimes the way he talks about politicians and the fact that others don't understand MMT, he seems to think that it just boils down to their ignorance and that they're just stupid and aren't making the right policies. But the ruling class have a vested interest in not allowing people to know this, or at least obfuscating the reality. Is very inconvenient. It's inconvenient for the dominant socio-political order. It's like destabilizing what Plato would call a noble lie. It could have cataclysmic consequences in empowering the dominated classes of society. So, yeah, I think you touched on something very important there, because MMTers will try to. Stephanie Kelton, in her book The Deficit Myth, mentions how she would try to persuade politicians that this was true, and some politicians ended up at least on the Democrats, ended up accepting it. But they would say, no way my voters could ever, no way I could tell my voters this. I wouldn't,
Right.
I would lose support, or I would lose donors, I would lose funding, etc. I would be seen as a crazy. And it's difficult because when the people who know it's true don't want to admit it's true, you're in a position, well, I mean, how do you advocate for policies in a way that makes sense, that is sound? Because they're then forced to say, well, it's taxation, and they'll say, well, where are you going to get the money from? It's not the working class, so we'll tax the rich. And it's like, okay, fine, but like the math doesn't check out in terms of like if you tax the ruling class, you wouldn't be able to fund all of these programs if that's how you thought it worked, right? So you can't like fool people that way. So I find it at this point they should just expose the noble lie for what it is. But I think before we get into UBS and UBI, I think the Marxist angle is great because I've been following your podcast for quite a while, and you didn't always have that angle, the
That's right.
embracing Marxism. And very few MMTers do. And to be fair, it's not a problem really with MMT in my view. It has to do with the fact that most people in general aren't Marxists, especially in United States, most definitely, extremely. They have a phobia of anything related to Marxism. Although Bill Mitchell, one of the co-founders of MMT, is a Marxist, and he's been on your show, one of really great recent episode you did. Yeah, so when was that point when you finally did get introduced to Marxism? And I mean, I don't know how strongly you identify with a Marxist, or like I don't think
Pretty
either of us are that
strong.
dogmatic. Like dogmatic in terms of what kind, right?
I'm not
But
dogmatic. No,
yeah, the sects
so
and the
yeah, no.
sectarians. I don't care
I
either.
laugh about that stuff. Because here's the thing, right? It's good to inform ourselves from history. History is very, very important. I mean, I have dug in deeply into history going back to probably even before the fall of the Roman Empire. But my goal in going through history started originally, okay, with understanding the arc of revolution. Okay. That was my primary purpose in going backwards and starting to look at different revolutionary moments in time. And they're not moments in time at all, is what I found out, right? They're not moments in time. They're like a wave. And they start with certain things, certain contradictions that are just minor league, maybe annoying to people. And then they ramp up as the contradictions become more and more challenging to live with. And then they become impossible to ignore. And then the people rise up. And you can see Toussaint Louverture in Haiti is a prime example of this. This is the Obama of revolutionaries, okay? He is a non-revolutionary. He's a guy who saw himself as being one of the bourgeoisie. He wanted to be one of the ruling class. He wasn't really about the people. And Dessalines, who was one of the African Haitians, not one of the mulattoes or one of the other versions. If you've done any research on Haiti, there was a bunch of different sects by race and by nationality, etc., that kind of dominated the island even during that French occupancy when the French were the prime owners, if you will, of Haiti. And Toussaint sold out his top guys. This Jean-Jacques Dessalines would have ran through a brick wall for Toussaint Louverture. But he found out that Louverture was nothing more than just a sellout. And so what did Jean-Jacques Dessalines do? He put old Toussaint back to France, where he was put into a prison in I think the French Alps, and died in prison, died very lonely. And Dessalines beheaded and killed all of the French and Spanish and British. He really ran a complete and utter annihilation of those who were against him, and he freed the island of Haiti. But it took 50, 60, 70 years, and the brutality that they suffered. I mean, if you read C.L.R. James's book about Beyond the Black Jacobins, or the Black Jacobins, actually, and you realize the brutality, that they didn't treat them as humans. So all this stuff was going through my head as I learned about Haiti, as I learned about the French Revolution, and understanding the difference between a working class revolution and a bourgeois revolution, and understanding the differences of what they were fighting for and what they were striving to accomplish, and understanding that for every revolutionary force, there's a counter-revolutionary force. The royalists and the whole rise of Napoleon even. I mean, that entire thing is very instructive in understanding these things don't happen, number one, in a vacuum. Number two, they don't happen in a very, very small period of time. They happen in waves. And you see the ebbs and flows as the counter-revolution starts to try and take back power it once lost. And so a lot of the deaths and stuff that colored my mind about socialism, the brutal dictators of this, all the totalitarian that, and that was what I understood socialism to be, right? That was all I knew. I was a right-winger, so everything was either free stuff, they want free stuff, or it was they're brutal, the KGB and 1984 and Big Brother and all this other stuff. I live in the United States, and I'm telling you, that's here right now. We're living Big Brother, and we're watching the annihilation, fully funded by public money, of the Gaza, the the massacre of the Palestinian people, the genocide. Let's call it what it is. And you ask yourself, is this democracy? Did I vote for this? Did we vote for this? Is this what you thought saving democracy looked like? And you just realize every step through these processes, there is a counter-revolutionary force. There's always something waiting to fill those power vacuums. It's never easy. It's never clean. And so learning history, learning about these different quests for liberation, understanding, more importantly, like what happened during not only the rise and fall of the initial colonization of the United States and the bourgeois. Let's be fair, it wasn't a working class group of people that came to the United States. This was people with money that just didn't want to pay the crown. And watching them bring slaves and watching them bring feudal servants and so forth here, and then watching things like, uh-oh, did I screw up? Did I mess something?
I don't know what feudal servants.
I'm saying feudalism and servants, and I'm just trying to blend. There's a bunch of different aspects, different cultures, different relationships that came through. You had slaves, you had blacks that didn't speak English, you had blacks that did speak English, you had a whole host of folks that came together during Bacon's Revolution, or rebellion, excuse me. And this was the first time we got to see people of all walks, that we'll call them the working class for lack of a better term, uniting together to push back. And what did they do? They immediately made laws to cripple the slaves, quite frankly, that did speak English. They said, no, we can't have that. We need to have the slaves that don't speak English, because if they speak English, then they can go ahead and work together and they'll think about how to get their liberation. We need people that are not intelligent. We'll keep them stupid. We'll keep them from learning how to read. We'll keep them completely locked in on only these things, and then we can control them. But you watch the way that played out, and they put that down harsh, and they changed the rules and laws. And you watch when we, quote unquote, freed the slaves after the Civil War, only to find out that we had, hey, guess what? We're going to have Reconstruction, and we're going to have these new Jim Crow laws, and we're going to have these vagrancy laws that are going to put these people back in jail. So all the while through, if you had your eyes open, you've seen that we've not really had democracy in this country from day one. I mean, Howard Zinn's great book, The People's History of the U.S., shows how even then they would have stores of grain. People would be starving in the streets, but stores of grain locked up, and they would send them off to war to fight in the Mexican-American War, knowing that when they went, they would probably die, and they would never be able to collect on the food or the money that they were owed or anything else. So all these instances throughout history are there for us to look at and read. And I think probably the most important one, even though I'm sure there's a million of them that somebody would say are important, is the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, this did not happen in 5 minutes either. I mean, this went back to the 1800s. You had Marx and Engels writing about this stuff. You had later on people like Lenin coming through the door writing about this stuff. And what you watch is ultimately the world in awe as the Bolsheviks took on their government, and their government was fatigued. Their soldiers were whooped from fighting World War I. They had lost millions of men and women, and it was horrible. And they didn't have the stomach for war. And it was, don't want to say it was a completely bloodless revolution, But in many ways, it wasn't the kind of revolution that we think about. It wasn't that whole bloody massacre. It was largely, there was some killing, but it wasn't like what you would think. And the world took notice. And my favorite author out there right now, at least book-wise, is Clara Mattei. She wrote this book called The Capital Order. And she explained that the world, the hyper overreaction to what they saw with the Bolshevik Revolution and capital, saying, oh, no, we can't have this. And all the economists rallied around to really codify and create austerity. So all these conditions have been going on for a long time. And there's been a war against working class for a long time. I mean, I live in Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania is where the first police officers really came into play. They were freaking hired by the coal companies to make the workers, coal miners, go back to work. And what did they do? They opened fire and killed tons of Pennsylvanians that worked in the mines out here. It's not far from where I actually live. So you can see from day one the clash between capital and labor. You can see the class interests from day one, eradicating, annihilating, genociding the Native Americans that really are native to this nation that I live in. But you can see it around the world. And if you take notice, you can see where the power relationships are, the power dynamics are, who's in control, whose class interests are involved. And I think that if you allow that to inform yourself of the state today has the power to send billions of dollars of military gear to Ukraine and to Israel, all at the same time without raising taxes one penny, by the way, not a single tax increase to pay for any of that, while simultaneously telling every citizen in the United States, we can't afford to wipe out your student debt. We can't provide you with Medicare. We can't provide you with high-speed rail. We can't provide you with universal child care. We can't provide you with a federal job guarantee. We can't provide you with a cost of living increase for Social Security, on and on and on. So the contradictions of a nation that can create currency and can spend it into existence, but it only has it for the war machine and things that serve capital and not for we the people, and have convinced us all that it's wanting free stuff and that you're a moocher and all these other derogatory things that keep us trapped in that mindset. I think that's why MMT is so difficult for people to really get their head around. Not to mention all the lies that they've been told by classical economists like people like Milton Friedman and others who have made us believe that inflation is always at all times a monetary phenomenon. Whenever the government spends money, it creates inflation because they think of inflation as inflating the money supply because they still believe that we're on a commodity money like gold. And even if we were on a gold standard, it still wouldn't apply. But this is stuff that informs the left too, because if you read Marx and Capital, you understand that Marx wrote from a position of commodity money. I know that there's some mentions in volume 3 of fiat type arrangements. He didn't understand money. Marx didn't understand money. And so for me, a lot of this push into this class analysis and into blending MMT with more of a socialist perspective and really understanding the class antagonisms and understanding our own class interests, it's really created quite an interesting set of dynamics in terms of who's on your side, who listens, who's willing to listen, who doesn't just automatically say, oh, you just want to save capitalism, which is a lie, of course, but they can't help themselves. It really produces a whole new set of friends and allies and detractors, people that without listening to what you're having to say, without reading a single thing, they fall back to that hard ideology, that very, very rote, dogmatic, thus saith the Marx. And it's an impenetrable bubble at this point in time. I'm hoping that between your work and others' work, and hopefully in some small way our work, it's able to bridge that gap and close some of the loops on that so that we can all at least understand the way currency works, so that we can, in fact, inform each other of, if nothing else, even if we don't believe that we can ever do any nice thing with knowledge of MMT, at least understand what they are doing to us in real terms and really understand the class interests of the capital class and what they're doing to us, and explain it to people in a way that hopefully radicalizes them and makes them more aware and open to change. And that's kind of where I land on that one.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of interesting things there, and I would like to respond to one of those things, even though I think it is a bit off topic. But you have been focusing a lot on that in your podcast series. You have done multiple interesting episodes on revolutions like the Chinese Revolution, Russian Revolution, Haitian Revolution with Pascal Robert. I remember those were my favorite episodes. Very fascinating event. But about American Revolution, so I recently did a podcast, two of them that were public anyway, on the American Revolution with the historian James Vaughan. And some were very surprised by that because that one, it seemed oddly sympathetic to the American Revolution, which some people wouldn't have expected to come out of this podcast, given that I've been super scathing in my critique of American democracy and the United States in general. But the way I view the American Revolution is I view it as a product of its time, in its context, right? And in that context, it's a massive contradiction because on one hand, it's one of the most radical events that ever happened. In its history, it was immensely radical for its time. But paradoxically, because it was so radical in the sense that it was a full bourgeois revolution, in which it was a full establishment of a republic, whereas England was a compromise between feudal classes and the bourgeoisie, between parliament and the monarchs and the aristocracy. But in the context, the American Revolution was super radical, but that's also why it's extremely contradictory, because the bourgeoisie was really at the commanding heights of the revolution in the sense that they were able to essentially control how the system was designed. They designed a system that was so perfectly suited for the interests of the property owning classes that created a managed democracy in a way that was so perfectly managed. I believe it's the most perfectly managed democracy in the sense that it has the best of both an authoritarian system, like in this, it has a very strong presidency who can veto and have very centralized authoritarian power, while also having these checks and balances that prevent any faction of the capitalist class from dominating the others, which could destabilize the whole system. And also that checks and balances, they just pretty much check against the working class. We
Yes.
can't implement any policies because, healthcare, that would be unconstitutional. Oh, jobs guarantee, that would be a infringement on the rights of employers. But you name it. It's such a system that's good at controlling people. So that's my angle of how I critique it, rather than I think on the left there's this kind of critique, which is the US was founded on slavery and all that. And it's like, that's true, but that's not really unique to the US. I think genocide is, like, in the sense of manifest destiny, but that occurs a little bit later. But that is something I think unique to the settler colonial countries, which makes them kind of more culpable than many other countries. But that's my angle of critique, to be clear. But I think the thing that I try to emphasize is that we shouldn't abandon the hope of a democracy that the American Revolution unleashed, because we always have to remember that even though it ended up being controlled by the property owners, and you really see that the property owners get their full victory when the Constitution is established, when the Constitution is created with the convention that happens after the Shays Rebellion, which is sort of this sort of attempt where, like, farmers and various other groups are really destabilizing the order and threatening the dominant classes. And so you have this kind of divide between the petty artisan, the petty bourgeoisie, the artisan classes, who I would say are still, even though like they might marginally own some property, they're really within the dominated classes compared to the real property owners and the real capitalists. So with that, you had the end of what was radical about the American system, and there really had a lot of radical things going for it. I mean, back when there was all these different states having their constitutions, they had all these different experiments in democracy. Certain states didn't even have a Supreme Court, they didn't have a Senate. It was just a legislature elected by the people, and you didn't have this president, central figure who could just veto the power of the Congress. You really had a flourishing experimentation of democratic experiments that over time just got pretty much, there was a certain sense of counter-revolution. I do agree that that happened. The issue is it's still an establishment of a bourgeois republic. That's how I view the American Revolution, essentially. And in order to have a socialist radical politics succeed today, I believe that we can't abandon that hope of democracy. We have to abandon our faith in the idea that there is a democracy. That's the
Yeah.
kind of noble myth that enables the order. People I don't believe in the United States are going to succeed by using communist iconography from the Soviet Union. They're not going to succeed by saying also nothing was ever good about the American project. A lot of the tools that the left has at its disposal in which it could use are already in the history of the United States. Whether we can doubt the sincerity of the people who espouse that rhetoric is, up for debate, or freedom for who, democracy for who, that's all fair questions. But John Locke, who very much inspired the American Revolution, believed in the right to revolution. And he believed that if a government was to be despotic against its people, that there was a right for the people to essentially change their government and by force if necessary, by revolution. And Jefferson believed the same thing. In fact, Jefferson thought there should be a revolution ideally every 40 years. That's something we forget. Like, Jefferson is a contradictory figure, a guy who was not so good on the whole slavery thing. He showed some signs of racism, at least more than the other founders did. The founders, surprisingly, it's actually quite nuanced, their racial views. But Jefferson really is the democratic guy. I mean, and there's a reason why the French Revolution are so inspired by him. They literally use his language and everything. I mean, come on, like, what greater tool is that for radical than that, right? The legacy of democracy. And I think that's the great angle of critique, is the fact that capitalism and the ruling class are undermining democracy, and that what we really have is an unfinished revolution. The dominated classes, we didn't see it, right? We didn't see it, but we should demand it, right? Rather than saying, oh, that hope was bullshit, right? That's kind of my angle, just to clarify it. And less even a response to what you were saying, but also to the audience, because I got a lot of mixed feedback on my last 2 podcasts on the American Revolution.
Yeah, let me just say this. What I'm trying to say, the point of me going through the arc of revolution and breaking out those different things, is to kind of show where we are right now. Okay, we're watching police, and there's a reason for this. We're going to talk about UBS. Okay, we're going to talk about universal basic services and the need for universal basic services. And I don't want it to come out of left field when I say, to your point, here's this aspirational goal. Here is this ideal that services radical democracy, that services a working class revival almost. I mean, here's the fulfillment of all these promises that we could do, right? We can set that right here. And then we have people, and I would go so far as to say the vast majority of people, okay, don't have any of that. Even if they can go to play a game of Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune or something like that, where they can call out these factoids, just a bunch of facts, they haven't integrated them. They haven't pulled them together to see how these things play into their aspiration for a Green New Deal, high-speed rail, any of these things, right? And they don't understand how it couldn't be. And so they keep going back to the well because they refuse to accept that they don't live in a democracy. They refuse to accept the class-based understanding of who does control the levers of power and who they listen to and whose interests they serve. It sounds like a conspiracy. It sounds like you're talking about the creature from Jekyll Isle, or sounds like you're coming up with some Rothschilds or some weird, the bloodline thing. I mean, people just can't quite deal with reality as it stands. It doesn't mean that there aren't all these evil plots from wealthy people or whatever. Maybe these things are happening in plain sight, but really just keeping it 100% in between the lines momentarily. The idea that the things we think we have, the ability to go and vote, it's a placebo effect within this space right now, within the current iteration, machination of the United States, and in many cases around the world, because Europe is a vassal of the United States. Let's be fair. We're not dealing with the disintegration of empire, contrary to everyone's desires and hopes and dreams and so forth. We're watching empire on display right now. We're watching who it serves, and we're watching, if you pay any attention to the fight for degrowth and understanding the role of the IMF, World Bank, WTO, et cetera, and the Global South, and the way trade is made up, and why they exported jobs away, why they exported production away, and why supply chains crumble and things like that, and why there's inflation. all these things go into when you start trying to talk about, hey, you know what? I think we need to have universal basic services, which I think is the most superior approach to delivering a society we'd want to live in, right? A society that the left and as a whole would embrace at some level. I mean, obviously, we're not talking about a complete and utter, we own all the means of production. There is no more capital. There is no country. There is no money. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the next meaningful, pragmatic, logical step. And I hate the word pragmatism because that's not really what I'm trying to say here. It's just saying within reach, within the acceptable language that people even hear. I mean, you can't even get them to hear, like you were saying, things like communist talking points and using these communist terms and phrases and using communist imagery and things like that. It isn't the win many think it is, because it really just stops it dead in its tracks. They don't hear anything after that. But I think it's important to understand that what we're going through right here, right now, as we begin to talk about UBS, is that the system is not set up to give us universal basic services. The power dynamics are not set up to give us universal basic services. The electoral process that we would hope to get elected representatives to vote for this is not there for us either. And the capture and the enclosure of all these institutions, the corruption of these institutions, the veneer of democracy that we hold on to for dear life, it's a facade. It's manufacturing consent. And so to me, I want to level set for people that I'm not Pollyanna, that I don't have rose-colored glasses on, that I'm not sitting here just saying, let's just get a few more progressives in office and damn, we got UBS right there. No problem at all. I want to make clear people understand what they have to do to get, if this sounds good, if UBS sounds good to you, you must soberly consider the world you live in and understand your agency to affect and make that come to be. And at this point in time, I believe we are somewhere near less than zero through the electoral path. Anyway, that's my take. That's where I was coming from.
Right. And I think your position, just to be clear, you're not saying that, oh, just like revolution now, like it's just somehow going to happen out of nowhere, but rather that
Right.
we should be honest with ourselves or elucidate the real obstacles to electoralism that exist, rather than thinking that, one, the ruling class is going to allow democratic socialist forces to play the game fairly, right? Like, of course not. Common sense. And I think some people who are from like upper managerial backgrounds, cushy jobs, they don't really see that, because while they're not part of the upper classes per se, like the real elites, they don't have their face getting stomped by the boot of the ruling class. They're like in the between. They're still in the sitting in first class. They're not quite experiencing the disillusionment that so many people feel intuitively, right? Why I think so many people don't vote, not out of a pure ignorance, not out of the fact that they're stupid per se, or that they just don't know better. I think a lot of them intuitively really sense, and they're to a large extent correct, that there isn't a difference. Like, it's not going to make a big difference. Like, they might make a small difference here and there, but it's like, what does it do for me, right? What does it do for me? And I think people really understand that. But the other big thing that I found interesting about MMT, right, and this is sort of going to be our segue into UBS and UBI, is those who believe that you can just, okay, elect candidates and implement these policies like UBS or UBI to fit the public purpose, to benefit the general interests of society, right? I find it interesting because they'll say, oh, Marxism is too radical. I'm not going to embrace that. That's kind of extreme. I'm more pragmatic. But if you implement a policy like a job guarantee, for example, that would guarantee everyone work, which would automatically increase the bargaining power of the working class, so that they could more easily leave their job and go to another job if that job was treating them poorly, that would decrease the power of the capitalists dramatically. So would UBI even, right? Even UBI is a much less radical power, I think there's a reason why UBI, I believe, is a more capitalist policy, but I think there's a reason powers haven't implemented it. Like in Canada, there was actually a big move by some faction of the Liberal Party to implement UBI to turn the temporary income into a permanent one. And it got quickly shut down. The Canadian Small Business Association actually was the loudest lobby against it. And they lobbied, the Conservative Party were hard against it. And even the Liberal Party ended up just abandoning it totally. And because these policies are declarations of class warfare in some form, even if it's not an extreme form, they are. So the ruling class is they're going to see it that way. It's like people who tell me, oh, Marx, yeah, that's too much. What about Henry George? What about we have a Georgism, a land value tax where we basically tax the rich's, the wealthy's property out of existence? I'm like, that's class warfare. Like, at that point, just be a Marxist. Like, I don't get it. And yeah, so that's like how I feel about the MMTers. That's worth some people who might see UBS as a light reform. I mean, what is universal basic services exactly? And why is it better than a universal basic income? Because a lot of people who are new, haven't explored MMT too much, they just heard about it. They tend to just assume that MMTers are proponents of UBI. They think that, well, if you think the government can't run out of money, that they'll just give everyone money, right? That's like common sense. But all the MMTers I know are proponents of like a job guarantee or something along the lines of closer to universal basic services. They kind of tend to differ, but none of them, from what I've seen, really are like big UBI proponents. So
No.
I'd like you to lay out the case as to what UBS is and why is it better than UBI.
Sure. So UBI stands for universal or unconditional.
Well, that'll be it for this episode. Part 2, the second half of this podcast, will be uploaded next week. You can get access to Part 2 early right now on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you not only get access to a lot of content early before everyone else does, but you also get access to exclusive content. You get access to the exclusive Backroom podcast, which is for patrons only. If you get value out of One Dime Radio and the videos that I do on the One Dime channel, then why not become a patron if you haven't already? It's not much for you individually, but if a bunch of you become patrons, then it is massive for me. Pretty much depends as to whether this channel survives or dies. But if you have like zero monies, then you can support the podcast by sharing it around and giving it a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen to this. See you in the next episode.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.